There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a regime when it realizes the thing keeping it alive is dying. Not the silence of a ceasefire, not the silence of diplomacy, the silence of engineers staring at pressure gauges that are never going back up. Iran's oil fields did not get bombed into shutdown. No missile targeted them. No special operation severed their pipelines. What is happening to Iran's 3 last functioning major oil fields is something far more permanent than a bomb crater. It is geological. When you shut down an oil well under the wrong conditions, too fast, too long, without the pressure maintenance infrastructure to keep the reservoir stable, the formation collapses. The crude migrates. The pressure equalizes in ways that no drilling program, no matter how well funded, can fully reverse. Iran's petroleum engineers know this. They have known it for weeks. And according to sourcing cited by Iran International and confirmed through satellite thermal imaging analysis by 2 independent energy intelligence firms, the shutdown of Iran's last 3 functioning major export fields is no longer a future risk. It is already happening. Stay with American Echo. Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Because what is unfolding inside Iran's oil infrastructure right now is not a temporary setback that ends when a ceasefire is signed. It is a structural amputation of the Islamic Republic's economic foundation. And the regime's own internal documents confirm they know they cannot reverse it. To understand why this shutdown is different from everything that came before it, you need to understand the baseline condition of Iran's oil infrastructure before this conflict even began. Because here is what the headlines consistently miss. Iran's oil fields were already dying before the first American bomb fell. The Islamic Republic inherited some of the world's most productive petroleum geology when it came to power in 1979. The Ahvaz field, the Marun field, the Yadavaran field, massive, ancient reservoirs sitting beneath the Zagros geological formation in southwestern Iran, capable in their prime of producing millions of barrels per day. In 1974, Iran was producing approximately 6 million barrels per day. At its post-revolution peak in the late 1970s, even through the chaos of transition, it was still pushing above 5 million. Today, before the blockade, before the conflict, Iran's sustainable production capacity had already fallen to approximately 3.2 to 3.4 million barrels per day. That decline is not primarily the result of sanctions. Sanctions made it worse. But the underlying cause is something more fundamental. Iran's major oil fields are old, deeply, structurally old. The Ahvaz field has been producing continuously since 1958, the Marun field since 1964, the Yadavaran field since 1937. These reservoirs have been drawn down for between 60 and 87 years. Their natural pressure, the geological pressure that pushes crude oil upward toward the surface, has been declining for decades. Modern petroleum engineering compensates for this through enhanced oil recovery, water injection, gas reinjection, pressure maintenance programs that pump fluids back into the reservoir to sustain the drive mechanism that moves oil to the surface. Iran has been chronically underinvesting in these pressure maintenance programs for over 20 years. Sanctions limited access to the technology. Budget pressures diverted capital. The IRGC's parallel economy captured resources that should have gone into field maintenance. The result is a set of oil fields that were already fragile before this conflict began, fields operating closer to their natural decline curve than their engineering specifications. Fields where the margin between managed production and irreversible damage was already thinner than Iranian state media has ever publicly acknowledged. Then the blockade came. Then Kharg Island fell. And then the shutdown began. To walk you through is the reason why this shutdown is categorically different from anything Iran has experienced before. And it is the detail that Iran's government is desperately trying to keep out of public discussion. The 3 fields in question are Ahvaz, Marun, and Yadavaran. Each one is shutting down for a slightly different reason, but the outcome for each is the same, the Ahvaz field. Ahvaz is Iran's single largest oil field. At peak, it produced over 1 million barrels per day. In recent years, with declining reservoir pressure and aging infrastructure, it had been producing approximately 750,000 to 850,000 barrels per day. Ahvaz requires continuous water injection to maintain reservoir pressure. The water injection infrastructure runs on electricity. The electricity infrastructure on Iran's southwestern grid, the grid serving Khuzestan province where Ahvaz sits, has been operating at severely reduced capacity since strikes on Iranian power infrastructure earlier in this conflict. Without continuous water injection, the reservoir pressure in Ahvaz drops. When it drops past a critical threshold, a phenomenon petroleum engineers call water coning begins. Groundwater from surrounding geological formations invades the reservoir. It mixes with the crude. It damages the production zones in ways that cannot be undone by simply restarting the pumps. Satellite thermal imaging analysis cited by energy intelligence firm Kairos shows that Ahvaz's surface processing facilities have been operating at dramatically reduced heat signatures since late April 2026. The wells are not producing at anything close to normal rates. Marun is Iran's second largest producer, approximately 500,000 to 600,000 barrels per day under normal conditions. Like Ahvaz, it depends on gas reinjection to maintain reservoir drive. The gas reinjection compressors at Marun run on natural gas sourced through pipeline infrastructure that connects to Iran's South Pars gas complex. That pipeline infrastructure has been disrupted. The compressors are not running at design capacity. Without gas reinjection, Marun's reservoir pressure declines. The oil in the formation begins to migrate laterally rather than moving vertically toward the production wells. Recovery rates fall, and if the pressure drops far enough, the migration becomes permanent. The oil physically moves to parts of the reservoir that existing wells cannot reach. Re-drilling to chase migrated oil in a depleted, pressure-compromised reservoir is not impossible, but it is enormously expensive, technically complex, and takes years, not months, years. Yadavaran is Iran's newest major producing field. It came online in phases from 2016 onward and was supposed to represent the future of Iranian oil production. China's CNPC was the primary developer and operator. Here is the critical detail about Yadavaran. It was developed using Chinese technology, Chinese equipment, and Chinese operational personnel. When China quietly began pulling its technical staff from Iranian oil operations in early April 2026, a withdrawal that received almost no Western media coverage but was confirmed by multiple energy sector sources, Yadavaran lost the operational expertise required to manage its production safely. Chinese petroleum engineers are not simply interchangeable with Iranian ones on a complex field developed entirely with Chinese specifications. The control systems, the monitoring protocols, the pressure management procedures, all of it was designed around CNPC's operational framework. Without that framework, Yadavaran is not being mismanaged. It is being managed by engineers who are working from documentation they did not write, on systems they did not design. For a reservoir, they have been operating for less time than their Chinese counterparts. The error margin on a young, high-pressure field managed under those conditions is not theoretical. It is operational, and the consequences of errors on a high-pressure reservoir are not recoverable in the short term. Let that word settle for a moment. Irreversible. In the context of petroleum engineering, irreversible production loss has a specific technical meaning that is worth understanding precisely, because it is not a dramatic term being used for rhetorical effect. It is an engineering classification. When a reservoir undergoes pressure depletion below what engineers call the bubble point, the pressure threshold at which dissolved gas begins to separate from the oil, the crude itself changes chemically. Gas comes out of solution. It forms bubbles in the reservoir rock. Those bubbles occupy pore space that oil used to occupy. And unlike liquid oil, gas in reservoir rock cannot simply be pushed back into solution by restoring surface pressure. Below the bubble point, you are no longer producing from the same reservoir you started with. You are producing from a fundamentally different, permanently altered geological system. Antoine Hauff, co-founder and chief analyst at Kairos, explained it to multiple outlets in terms that are impossible to misinterpret. Once wells are shut in, under these conditions. Especially in Iran's aging fields, restarting them is not guaranteed. Analysts estimate the permanent production loss at between 300,000 and 500,000 barrels per day. That estimate was made before the full scope of the current shutdown was clear. Current analysis from the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy, incorporating the Ahvaz, Marun, and Yadavaran shutdowns, suggests the permanent production loss figure may now be closer to 800,000 to 1.1 million barrels per day. Let that number settle as well. Iran's total pre-conflict production was approximately 3.2 to 3.4 million barrels per day. A permanent loss of 800,000 to 1.1 million barrels per day does not represent a temporary reduction that recovers when the ceasefire is signed. It represents a permanent reduction of between 25% and 34% of Iran's total production capacity. Forever, not for the duration of this conflict, not for the duration of sanctions, for the geological lifetime of those reservoirs, which is measured in decades. Iran is not losing this month's oil revenue. It is surrendering a permanent portion of its future capacity. And the regime's own petroleum engineers, according to sourcing cited by Iran International, have told senior officials exactly that in writing. Make sure you are subscribed to American Echo and have your notifications turned on, because the internal regime response to this crisis tells you more about how desperate the situation actually is than any external analysis can. Here is what a regime with genuine confidence in its infrastructure recovery would be doing right now. It would be publicly announcing emergency repair timelines. It would be deploying its national oil company engineers to the affected fields with maximum urgency. It would be seeking emergency technical assistance through any diplomatic channel available. It would be making the case to its domestic audience that the damage is temporary and recovery is underway. Here is what the Iranian regime is actually doing. It is not announcing repair timelines, not because it has not been asked. Because it cannot announce a timeline it does not believe. The national Iranian oil company has not made a single public statement about restoration timelines for Ahvaz, Marun, or Yadavaran since the shutdown began. That silence is not strategic communications management. It is the silence of an organization that has received engineering assessments it cannot put in front of the public without triggering exactly the domestic unrest its security apparatus is already warning about. The regime is doing one thing with its remaining operational energy. It is trying to restart the Firuzan offshore field and the Salman field, smaller, less complex offshore reservoirs that do not carry the same irreversible damage risk as the big onshore producers. But here is the problem with that strategy. Firuzan and Salman together, at maximum capacity, produce approximately 120,000 to 150,000 barrels per day combined. Iran's pre-blockade export revenue required approximately 1.8 million barrels per day to generate. The gap between 120,000 and 1.8 million is not a shortfall, it is a structural collapse. And meanwhile, the clock that Iran's own Supreme National Security Council identified as their survival timeline, the 6 to 8 week window before domestic unrest becomes inevitable, is ticking. It was ticking before Kharg Island. It was ticking before the Ahvaz shutdown, before the Marun pressure collapse, before the Chinese engineers left Yadavaran. Every week that passes without restoration of export revenue is a week that does not come back. The reserves are finite. The subsidies are funded from those reserves. The IRGC payroll is funded from those reserves. The bread subsidies preventing street protests in Tehran, Isfahan, and Mashhad are funded from those reserves. The Iranian regime is not managing an energy crisis. It is managing a countdown. The permanent loss of 800,000 to 1.1 million barrels per day from Iran's production capacity does not stay inside Iran's borders. It ripples outward through every energy market, every geopolitical calculation, and every strategic planning document in every capital that depends on Persian Gulf oil. For global oil markets, the immediate impact is already visible. Brent crude has been trading above $120 per barrel since the Kharg Island operation. The addition of permanent Iranian production loss to the supply calculation is pushing analyst price targets higher. Goldman Sachs revised its 12-month Brent forecast upward following the field shutdown reports. JP Morgan's commodity desk is modeling a scenario in which Iranian production does not recover to pre-conflict levels for 3 to 5 years at minimum. That is not a price spike. That is a structural supply shift that reprices energy globally for years. For Saudi Arabia, the calculation is both strategic and economic. Riyadh has spare production capacity of approximately 2 to 2.5 million barrels per day. At $120 per barrel, every additional barrel Saudi Arabia produces generates revenue that funds Vision 2030, that funds the defense buildup, that funds the infrastructure programs Mohammed bin Salman has staked his legitimacy on. Saudi Arabia is not going to rush to fill Iran's production gap, not because it cannot, because every week that gap persists is a week of elevated prices and elevated Saudi revenue. Riyadh has every financial incentive to let the gap persist for as long as geopolitically manageable. For China, the shutdown of Yadavaran, a field China built, developed, and staffed, is a direct financial loss that Beijing has not publicly acknowledged but cannot privately ignore. CNPC's investment in Yadavaran across multiple development phases runs into billions of dollars. That investment is now producing at a fraction of its designed capacity, under conditions that Chinese engineers have left and Iranian engineers are struggling to manage. China is watching its single largest overseas energy development asset deteriorate in real time, and it can do nothing about it without either re-engaging with Iran under U.S. blockade conditions or accepting the loss. For Russia, elevated oil prices continue to fill Moscow's war budget. But Russian energy analysts are also watching something more strategically significant. If Iran's permanent production loss reshapes the global supply landscape for 3 to 5 years, OPEC's internal dynamics shift fundamentally. Russia's own leverage within the OPEC Plus framework changes. The entire architecture of global energy cooperation that Russia has spent a decade positioning itself within gets reorganized around a new baseline. Moscow is not simply watching a rival suffer. It is watching the global energy chessboard reset, and it is calculating how to position for the new configuration. Here is where everything stands and what it actually means. Iran did not just lose this month's oil revenue. Iran did not just lose this year's production targets. Iran lost permanently and irreversibly between a quarter and a third of its total oil production capacity in fields that took decades to develop, using technology it can no longer access, with Chinese partners who have left through a process that its own engineers have told its own government in writing cannot be fully reversed. The Islamic Republic was built on a specific economic foundation. Oil revenue funding the state funding the IRGC enforcing the regime distributing enough subsidy to keep the population from the streets. Remove the oil revenue permanently, and you do not just create a budget problem. You remove the foundation, not temporarily, not until sanctions lift or a ceasefire holds, permanently, geologically. In ways that pressure gauges measure and engineers certify and no political decision can undo. Iran's regime has survived sanctions before. It has survived diplomatic isolation. It has survived currency crises and inflation and protest waves. It has never before faced the permanent destruction of the geological asset its entire economic model depends on. The pressure gauges at Ahvaz are not going back up. The Chinese engineers at Yadavaran are not coming back. The bubble point at Marun has been crossed, and the regime that built its survival on the assumption that its oil would always be there, always flowing, always fundable, is now staring at instruments that are telling it something its leadership has spent 47 years refusing to hear. The wells are shutting down, and they are not coming back. Subscribe to American Echo right now so you never miss the analysis of what happens next as Iran's economic foundation permanently collapses. We will have continuous coverage of the field shutdown data, the regime's internal response, and whether the 6 to 8 week survival window Iran's own Security Council identified can hold under conditions that window was never designed to survive. Hit the notification bell Share this with anyone who needs to understand why what is happening to Iran's oil fields is categorically different from anything that came before it. And tell me in the comments, do you think Iran's regime can survive the permanent loss of a third of its oil production capacity? Or are we watching the beginning of the end of the Islamic Republic in real time? We will see you in the next one.